Okay, so the videos that we just watched gave you a little bit of background, how they got there, and the kind of main danger that they pose, which is to human beings. But the article that we're about to look at gives you a little more kind of ecological view of the situation there. So it looks at the ecological impact that they can potentially have, but it also looks at kind of mitigating circumstances. In other words, positive things that might come from their interaction with the ecosystem, right? So I'm going to go around and pass these out very quickly. What we're going to do, you're going to take this article, and I want you to go through and annotate it. Right? I know. It's only 3 pages, so calm down. When I say annotate, I don't mean as extensively as you do work in a literature class, for example.
I literally don't do work in a literature class.
Okay. For this, keep the chair on the floor. And for this one, I want you to go through and note the concepts that we've discussed in class. You can write on this sheet. I also want you to go through, we're going to have a couple of new terms in here that you guys can use specifically in places like FRQs. So again, this is stuff that will come in handy very soon. Okay, so all right, so you can tell by looking at the title of this right off the bat. Oh, and go ahead and put your name on this because it's going to come to the class. You can tell just by the title of this article that they're taking a different kind of point of view, right? Could Pablo Escobar's escaped hippos help the environment? So they're looking for ways that they will actually be beneficial to the environment that they're in right now. So Echeverri, that was the biologist that was in the video, presented a couple of different things. He said the first reaction of Colombia's government was when they realized that hippos could potentially be problematic, was to kill them, right? And I think in 2009 they shot one of them, and there was a huge pushback, both nationally from people in Colombia, but also internationally from animal rights groups and NGOs and international organizations that work with animals. They said hippos are vulnerable where they live, right? In Africa, they're vulnerable in their natural environment. So if we've got this population, then maybe we can find a place for them. So they're trying right now to kind of work and see if they can do that. But again, there hasn't been any kind of definite plans put forward. So he gave 3 different possibilities. He said you can kill them, you can relocate them, or you can sterilize them, right? And we'll talk about what that means as we go through this. But the other potential action that can be taken is to let them stay there, right? And just kind of educate people and tell them to be careful and kind of adjust to it, okay? So as we go through this, again, this is going to lead up to a debate, right? You guys are going to be doing a debate based on this information. So I want you to go through and find evidence. I want you to go through and find rhetorical arguments, put together a rhetorical argument for one side or the other, right? And we'll talk about what the dilemma is as we go through this. So I want you to go through and check for vocab. We'll read through it once to make sure everybody understands and point out some terms that can be useful. And then we'll go through it again so that you guys can look for evidence to back claims for either side. Okay? So, first part. Some scientists think Colombia's cocaine hippos could help fill in for long extinct megafauna, while others argue that they should go. So that term, oh, you didn't get one. That term, megafauna, is one that we've actually seen before. I don't know if you guys remember. Does anybody know what megafauna means?
Big people that it was in the park thing.
Yeah, what is fauna?
Animal.
Animals, right? So megafauna, mega means big, fauna means animals, so they're big animals. Specifically, and you can figure that out just by breaking the word down, right? But specifically, what kind of pattern do megafauna follow? If you think about large animals, if you got elephants, you got giraffes, you got hippos, rhinoceroses, what do they all have in common? They're all herbivores and they're grazers, right? So they don't have to run too much. They get most of their food around where they are, right? So they can build that up and increase their biomass just eating a lot, right? So megafauna. So when the notorious drug lord Pablo Escobar was shot dead in 1993, the Colombian government took control of his luxurious estate in northwestern Colombia, including his personal zoo. Most of the animals were shipped away, but the 4 hippopotamuses, of which Escobar was especially fond, were left to fend for themselves in a pond. Now there are dozens of them. So, second paragraph. For over a decade, the Colombian government has been pondering how to best curb the growing population, a strategy largely supported by conservation experts. But not everybody is on board. So that is the crux of the dilemma that you're going to address in the debate, right? And basically it boils down to, should they stay or should they go, right? Like the Clash song. So, are they okay where they are and they can be accommodated, or do they need to be moved somewhere else, right? Or do they need to be eradicated? So, and you're going to be looking for points on both sides as we go through this. Without direct evidence that the animals are doing harm, some ecologists argue that there's no reason to cull or relocate them. Indeed, the hippos could fill in for species that humans pushed to extinction thousands of years ago, an idea known as rewilding, right? So there are 2 terms in there that you need to be familiar with. One is cull, right? Cull, which is third line from the bottom, close to the beginning, right? Reason to cull or relocate them. Does anybody know what cull means? C-U-L-L. It sounds like kill, and it's a similar concept, but it's a little more specific than just killing. Killing can be vague, it can be indiscriminate, right? No. It's actually trying to prevent that. It's killing off organisms, but in a careful way, so that you're kind of trimming back the population and keeping it under a carrying capacity, but you're maintaining a viable population, right? And this is something that naturally is done between predators and prey. When we talked about the wolves of Isle Royal and the moose population there, if you think about moose, and you know anything about wolves, they're going to attack what kind of moose? Are they going to go for the strongest and the biggest ones? No, it would take too much energy to kill that kind of moose. And it's doubtful if even a pack of wolves could even do that, right? If you got a very strong moose, it could probably give them a hell of a fight, right? So, which one would they, what kind of moose would they go for? They're going for the weaker ones, the sicklier ones, the older ones, in some cases the younger ones that aren't able to defend themselves yet. So, removing those from the population actually makes the population of moose more viable, right? Because you're trimming out the ones that are less fit and allowing the stronger and more fit ones to survive. So that's the kind of natural balance. Now, when we do that, we may not be as keen on taking, especially the younger ones. If you're culling artificially, by humans are doing it, we tend to let the younger ones grow, but in some cases, you might take out the older ones or the sicker ones, right, to improve the overall health of the population. Okay, good. So cull is that. It's a very conscientious approach to eliminating organisms. What is rewilding? What sense do you get from reading it in context? Making the animals used to the wild. Kind of. But let me ask you this. What's the difference between, we talked about reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone. Rewilding is a slightly different concept. So what would be the difference between rewilding and reintroducing?
Rewilding is for something.
Good. So it sounds like when you put re at the beginning of a word, it sounds like doing it again. But in this case, you're releasing them into the wild, but in a different area, right? So reintroducing is where a species has been eliminated or extirpated. You allow them to go back and reoccupy that same ecosystem. Rewilding is taking a population that has been in captivity or been removed from an area and introducing it to another area where it either hasn't lived before or hasn't been for several thousand years and is no longer specifically adapted to. Right? So in this case, hippos have never been in South America. They've never been native to South America. There were megafauna that lived there before, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but hippos weren't them. But it is an ideal environment in a lot of ways for hippos. So reintroducing would be like taking wolves back to Yellowstone, like we were talking about, where they already lived. But rewilding wolves would be like introducing them somewhere in southern Chile, where they don't occur naturally, right? They don't live there naturally, but it is an environment that they could probably adapt to without too much trouble. It's another deciduous forest environment. And there are things like llamas, alpacas down there that they could potentially hunt, right? So, good. So, note both of those in that paragraph, right? Just have a little note there. When the hippos were left behind, it accidentally kicked off a rewilding experiment that's now been running for 25 years. The first results of this experiment are trickling in, and much like the large animals, they are muddying the waters, right? So it's not clear what the results are yet. The hippos have escaped Escobar's former ranch and moved into Colombia's main river, the Magdalena. Spread over a growing area, nobody knows exactly how many there are, but estimates range from a total population of 40 to 60, says Jonathan Shuren, an ecologist from University of California, San Diego, who studies the animals. Every year there are many babies, but it's unknown how many reach adulthood. So, the Magdalena River has a basin similar to the Amazon. Not as big, right? And if you look on a map, the Magdalena runs kind of north here, from the mountains up to the Caribbean Ocean, right? So it kind of runs through here. So it's got its own basin. The Orinoco River has its own basin as well, and then the Amazon is all of this. So it's not contiguous to the Amazon, but it's a similar kind of environment. Okay, the hippos present quite a problem for the government. David Echeverri, who's the same guy from the video, a researcher with the Colombian government's environmental agency, CONADE, which is overseeing management of the animals, says he has no doubt they act like an invasive species. If allowed to remain unchecked, they will displace endemic animals like the otters and manatees, he says. They also pose a danger to local residents since they can be territorial and aggressive, though no serious injuries or death have occurred as yet. And up until today, that's true. They haven't killed anything. That would change the whole kind of dynamic of this situation. And it would make probably a much more negative public view. But for right now, they've been somewhat manageable. So in that paragraph, you got a couple of things. One, invasive species. They act like an invasive species. What is the definition of an invasive species? Mr. Randall, you're looking at me.
They take over population.
They come into an ecosystem and they do take over, but let's be a little more specific. Where do they come from? They come from somewhere outside, so they are not native to that ecosystem, right? They come into that ecosystem, and what do you mean by take over?
They use their resources, and they don't have any population.
But they don't just use them, right? There's already existing niches that are occupied in that ecosystem, so they come in and do what? Eventually they might unbalance it, but they outcompete the native species. So that's an important part. So you got organisms coming in from another area, and they outcompete organisms that are already occupying niches there. And there's one more important thing. What allows them to flourish?
They have no natural predators.
Good, no natural predators, right? So those three things are important for an invasive species. They come from outside of the ecosystem. They often outcompete the organisms that are already there for resources, and they grow like crazy because they don't have natural predators. So the only limit for them in that ecosystem is what they can eat, right? How much they can consume. Okay, good. So make a little note there. Also, in the next line, you've got the word endemic. What does endemic mean? Good. It means native, right? Something that is from that area. That's a good science and just general term, a good vocab word to use. So when you guys get to FRQs at the end of the year, there is virtually guaranteed to be some question that will be about native species or invasive species in some way. That's one of the things that they really like to ask. So knowing that you can use something like endemic rather than just saying native will look that much better for you, right? It's good vocabulary to kind of work in. Okay. After one hippo was killed in 2009, there was a quick public outcry, quashing any plans to cull them. Instead, the government has been investigating ways to sterilize the creatures or to move them out of the wild into captive facilities, Echeverri says. But the animals weigh thousands of pounds and aren't exactly fond of human handling, so relocating or castrating them is both dangerous, difficult, and expensive. One juvenile hippo was successfully moved to a Colombian zoo in early September, but it cost 15 million pesos, or about $5,000 US. So, sterilizing is a very general term. It's kind of a vague term that can apply to males or females, right? Spay or neuter in terms of pets. But castrating is much more specifically sterilizing males. So, happy International Men's Day. Castrating hippo. Now, normally, in the case of mammals, if you're going to sterilize a population, it is sufficient to go through and just castrate the males. It is easier because typically mammals have external testes or gonads, right? They have external primary reproductive parts, right? So generally it's a non-invasive procedure if you go through and castrate the males of the population. But hippos are a little bit troublesome because they do not have external testes, they have internal testes. So no matter whether you're sterilizing males or females, it is going to be an invasive procedure. And if you're going to do an invasive procedure on something as big as a hippo, Mr. Jones, what are you going to have to do? How? How are you going to knock out a hippo?
Cocaine.
You're going to have to use tranquilizers. Good. So you're going to have to use tranquilizers. Now, hippos have very notoriously thick skin, right? They have a lot of blubber under their skin. And that blubber protects them, obviously, from cold and from the water and everything, but it also protects them from tranquilizer darts. If you're going to introduce a sedative into an organism's system, then it has to reach muscle tissue, right? It has to get into the bloodstream. So if it goes into the adipose tissue, the fatty tissue of the hippo, it's not going to be enough, right? It's not going to sedate that hippo. So often, in order to sedate them, people have to fire multiple tranquilizer darts, sometimes 5 or 6, in order to get enough purchase in the hippo where you can slow it down. But if you have to fire that many darts, it is also very uncertain how sedated that hippo is. You can very easily oversedate them, which could result in their death, right, if their breathing gets too depressed. Or you could not sedate them enough, which is almost scarier. Because if you get them in and you're doing surgery and you think that they're under, and all of a sudden you have a hippo that wakes up in the middle of a sterilization procedure, that hippo is going to be pissed off, right? It is going to be angry, and they are very violent and aggressive. So that can be catastrophic and even deadly for whoever's doing that procedure. So it's a very dangerous prospect as well as expensive and time-consuming. So they've pretty much ruled out sterilization at this point. It's very difficult to do. Now, they also look at relocation here, but relocation itself is fairly expensive, right? It costs $5,000 to move a juvenile hippo to a zoo in Colombia that was more or less local. And there's only so many hippos that Colombia can take in its zoos. If you're going to try to situate them in zoos internationally or even intercontinentally, those prices are going to rise astronomically. And Colombia is not a country that has millions of dollars to blow on relocating a bunch of hippos, right? Also note that their growth pattern has increased markedly. There were 4 to begin with, probably in the late 80s. By the time that first video was filmed in 2003 or so, there were 16 of them. Now, this year, the one from this year, there are 50 of them. So you see an exponential growth curve there. And if they continue to wait much longer, that means you're going to, the price of relocating that population is going to skyrocket, right? Okay. So, for scientists and conservationists, the ultimate question is how these hippos impact the environment. The animals are foreigners, and in their native habitats, they can have dramatic impacts on the landscape. Because they feed on land but excrete their waste in water, they funnel nutrients from the terrestrial to aquatic environments. And when they alter water chemistry, they can make fish more vulnerable to predators. By simply moving their massive bodies through muddy areas, they can create channels for water flow that alter the structure of wetlands. Right? So just by moving around, they're so large and there's nothing like them in the Amazon, just by moving around, they're going to alter the landscape. Also note that it says they funnel nutrients from terrestrial to aquatic environments, that first underlined part there. What effect does that produce? That we talked about earlier in the year? The what? It does allow plant growth, but if you've got a bunch of nutrients suddenly hitting an aquatic system, what happens? It leads to algal blooms, but does anybody remember the term that's used for it? The E term?
Eutrophication.
Eutrophication, good. So eutrophication is a process, but the result absolutely is algal blooms and eventually dead zones, right? It kills all the oxygen in an area, and then you have fish dying in those areas, right? So, in fact, they affect local ecology so drastically that they're considered ecosystem engineers. And while that makes them key members of African communities, it also means they could have strong effects on their introduced habitats. So we talked about ecosystem engineers before in terms of keystone species, that they are vital for ecosystems. They help to keep that, help to stabilize and shape those ecosystems. Things like beavers. In this case, you have an invasive species that also happens to be an ecosystem engineer. So that makes them doubly dangerous for an ecosystem, right? They come in and they reproduce with no natural predators and with plenty of resources, but they also, just by existing, alter that environment. And when they do that, they can lead to, as Mr. Duraco said, they can destabilize that environment and knock it out of balance, right? Good. So, to further understand the animal's environmental impact, Shuren teamed up with Nelson Aranguren Riaño from the Teaching and Technological University of Columbia in a project funded by the National Geographic Society. They compared man-made lakes where the hippos hang out to ones that they don't frequent, looking at everything from the area's ecological diversity to its microbes and productivity. So, how do microbes come into this? Why are microbes important? Because what do they like to do as they're hanging out in the water? No, they do that on land generally. They defecate or they excrete, either of those are fine. They defecate or excrete in the water, and remember what we talked about with the wastewater management. When you have sewage leaking into a water system, often you will have microbes from those organisms that are present, right? Remember when we talked about... well, those are some of them, yeah. But you have... what was the... SCB. Fecal coliform bacteria, right? So you have certain microbes that are from human sewage that make their way into water systems. Hippos do the same thing. They have certain microbes that live in their gut that help them break down plants, right? When they excrete, some of those microbes come out with their discharge. The microbes that get into those water systems are not native to that area and can cause a lot of disease and problems in that area, right? So just by defecating, they can change the chemistry or the makeup of a stream. Let's see. The project found some slight but detectable differences. Hippos are essentially fertilizing the lakes that they frequent with their feces, for example, which is generally seen as a negative for the environment because it can lead to toxic algal blooms and even die-offs, like we said, something that hippos have caused in human-impacted watersheds in Africa. But Shuren emphasizes the differences are really slight. They're measurable but not dramatic. In other words, well, he says it's like it's not going from a super clean, clear water lake to a super green lake. In other words, a system that is very low in nutrients to a system that's very high in nutrients. It's going from a system that already has quite a bit of nutrients to even more, right? So it's not catastrophic, but it is noticeable. And some scientists have suggested nutrient pulses and even fish kills from hippos are actually a feature, not a flaw, of their presence. Nutrient pulses is a term that we will run into as we get into pollution a little later on. Nutrient pulses are regular influxes of nutrients that will make their way into water systems. So if you have a stream that runs through an agricultural area and you have runoff from those agricultural fields that has fertilizer in it, that runoff will occur somewhat regularly, right? If you have any rains that wash fertilizer down into the water system, or if you have irrigation methods that are less effective, that wash it into water systems, and those can both be nutrient pulses, right? So make a circle around that term. The addition of nutrients or oxygen-poor waters may subtly influence which species dominate in aquatic communities, or perhaps even increase the total species diversity by creating variable habitats within the river, some researchers suggest. Even large fish kills might have once served as a regular food resource for scavengers. So, what they're saying is that two different habitats might be created from the hippos depending on where they regularly defecate. Upriver, there might be less nutrients and certain fish have an advantage. Downstream, from where they defecate, there might be more nutrients and there might be a kind of different ecosystem that develops there, right? So you got habitat variation, which could potentially lead to diversity. But, and they say that even if fish are dying off from dead zones in the water, then that can be a kind of food source for scavengers. Anything that's scavenging through can pick up those dead fish. Jens Christian Svenning, a biologist with Aarhus University in Denmark, doesn't think people should assume the worst. In a letter last year in the journal Blah, he and a colleague argued that Escobar's hippos are one of several species introduced to South America that might provide ecosystem services provided by large herbivores that are now gone. Right? Ecosystem services. Make a note there that those can be either positive or negative effects. Ecosystem services are things that are kind of double-edged. They're complex. They can help certain species, but they can also harm certain species, right? In the case of the hippo, these might include funneling nutrients from land to water, like we already said, altering the structure of the wetlands, and keeping grassy plants in check by eating them. So they might act as a control on certain plants in whatever area they live in. South America lost dozens of giant herbivores in the last 20,000 years or so, including the somewhat hippo-esque toxodonts, which may or may not have been semi-aquatic. Hippos could likely contribute a partial restoration of these effects, likely benefiting native biodiversity overall, he says. He'd let the hippos be for now while monitoring the creatures to ensure they don't become a problem. So toxodonts were actually more closely related to elephants. They were a type of ungulate and that was larger, that was about the size of hippos, and probably lived a similar lifestyle that was semi-aquatic, semi-terrestrial. But they probably look significantly different. Does anybody know what a tapir is?
Yeah.
T-A-P-I-R,
Yeah.
right? Copy it? They're the largest kind of herbivores that are native to the jungle, and they have kind of a nose that's kind of prehensile. It can move around, but it's not as long as like an elephant's trunk, right? They're probably the length of this table, and they come up to about there in the shoulder, right? So they're like the size of a larger pig, right? Like a big kind of. The what?
They're way bigger than I assumed they were.
Oh no! Well, frequently, if you interact with them in the jungle, you'll interact with younger ones that are smaller, so they'll do, they won't step on things. But if they step on your toe, it probably hurt, but it wouldn't break anything. But they're pretty big things. Yeah. So, Shuren, however, isn't convinced that the animals are filling a niche vacated by extinct megafauna. Certainly, there were a lot of other large animals, but none of them were really quite like hippos. So, obviously, they're going to be different. They're going to occupy a niche differently than whatever organisms existed there before. So, story of survival. To Arian Wallach, the ecologist with the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia. Whether they can perfectly fill a lost niche or not isn't really the point. She stresses that hippos are considered vulnerable to extinction and considers having a refuge population outside of Africa to be a boon. What's a boon?
A good thing.
A good thing, yeah, it's like a gift, right? So, the fact that they are wild hippopotamuses in South America is a wonderful story of survival, of agency, of pioneering, she says. Wallach is not alone in her positive feelings. The animals have many fans. There's a local contingency that sees value in them and wants them to stay, explains Shuren. The charisma of the hippos and the fact that they are such celebrities creates quite a complex situation, Echeverri adds. They also attract tourists and tourism dollars, which may help offset some concerns about the animals. Upwards of 50,000 tourists visit Hacienda Nápoles every year, according to some estimates. Although, of course, not everybody's there to see the hippos. For now, without immediate plans to relocate or sterilize the animals, the creatures will continue to fend for themselves. Only time will tell if Colombia's cocaine hippos will become a permanent fixture of the landscape or a failed experiment, right? So, again, just make a note, if there are even general words like boon that we went through, if you haven't seen that one before, just kind of note what that means.
Yeah.
What I want you guys to do for right now, on the back, this is another older copy. On the back here, you've got a few questions, right? On the left-hand side are questions from the text. Go through and answer those, please. On the right-hand side, you've got some reflection questions. Don't worry about those right now. Just do these over here, right?
First to fourth.
1 through 4, yeah. Here on this side, on the left-hand side. As you do, I'll pass you around the sheet to use to put together your argument.
Yeah.
Is this done already?
Mr. Hall?
Yes. Oh, there's two. Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Is that just a general ground, one person with any kind of work? Okay.
No, don't let him. Not
Just go through and look for evidence, and I'll explain it here in a second. This one, don't worry about this one. I'll do this stuff first. Okay, so the way that this is set up, on the front, you have, remember what we talked about as the central dilemma here. Should they stay or should they go? So you're going to look for evidence that supports removing them from the environment or allowing them to stay in the environment. And you're going to kind of map out what those points of evidence are. So where you should start here is actually in the right-hand column, putting together the evidence as you go through the article. Then kind of extrapolate what that argument might be, right? So it is expensive to relocate them. It is difficult to sterilize them. You can put both of those points together in one kind of argument there, right? So go through and do the evidence first, and then you can kind of build up to the argument there. Then, once you've kind of completed this side of it, you choose one of those sides, and that's going to be your side for the debate, right? So you choose either, you say, okay, the stronger argument is either removing them or allowing them to stay. Then you're going to flip to the back, and you're going to elaborate on that argument a little bit. So take that information that you had over here on this side, and you're going to put it in this column. Everybody, eyes up here real quick. You're going to put it in this column, right? What I want you to do in this column, so you're basically taking stuff from the other side and kind of putting it there to kind of organize it a little bit, right? Then in this column, you're going to anticipate what the counter arguments would be, right? So for instance, if you say, I think that it is better not to remove the hippos, to allow them to stay, because it is very expensive, right? It's too expensive to move them, so we should let them stay. That's one of your points here. What would be a counter argument for that? What is a rebuttal that someone might make to your argument? No, you can't just say it's not expensive. You're demonstrating that it is expensive. All right, that's not argument. That's just obnoxious.
Yeah, that's how most people argue.
That's not arguing. That's just being stubborn. Yes. Okay. Yeah, you could say that having them there actually brings in money. So rather than being a drain on finances to move them, you keep them and manage them. Therefore, you're going to make some money rather than losing it. That's one way. Yeah, but that's actually supporting. That's not. That would be supporting the argument. That wouldn't be countering it. How would you rebut? How would you refute the argument? The what? Okay, who would potentially chip in money to relocate a bunch of hippos? I almost said hippies.
People who like care about animals and donations and like groups.
Yeah, so the same people who got outraged when the hippos got killed were international organizations, right? Like WWF and a lot of those things. So you could probably say, okay, if Colombia can't afford it, maybe you could put together a coalition to help. What else?
Well, you could say,
Guys, shh.
you could say the money used for tourism, that you get from tourism.
Relocate some of them. That might not be a bad idea. Yeah, okay. That would be maybe a way to build what she said into that same argument. Yes.
I kind of forgot what you said that I'm supposed to be refuting, so this would be that.
That it's expensive to move them.
Okay, you could say it's more expensive to like clean up the lakes that they're eutrophying.
That could be another way of refuting it. It might do more damage to let them stay, and the effect that they have on the ecosystem. So, for example, if you have people that live in that area that depend upon fishing, right? They might disrupt their fishing stocks, and therefore it would be more detrimental. Also, they could, if they make their way into towns, they could destroy property, they could kill people. That again would, you don't want to necessarily, use financial means to dictate the value of life, but it would eventually be somewhat expensive for the government to allow them to stay, right? So that could be your counter argument, right? Or, I'm sorry, that could be a counter argument to your argument, and then you would look for a way to address that. Okay, does everybody follow? Okay. Did you have a question? Okay. So, has everybody kind of moved on from those? Let's just very quickly go over the questions that were on the back here. So, what is the definition of an invasive species? Who has that?
Not native.
Not native, that's part of it, yes. What else?
Natural predator.
There are no natural predators,
Outcompete the native species.
and they outcompete native species. So look for those 3 points. Invasive species come from somewhere else, right? They're not native. They outcompete native species, and they disrupt their niches, and they also don't have a natural check on their population. Good. What's the current threat level in the CITES index that hippos have? They are considered to be vulnerable, right? Which appendix is that for CITES? Appendix 2, good. Where did you guys find that so fast? Yeah, but where on the internet? The internet's a big place. Okay. Well, you can, actually a good, quick place to find it also is just to, I hate to say this and I cringe because I'm a teacher, but Wikipedia usually has pretty good information there, right? Within a narrow scope, Wikipedia can be very reliable on certain information, right? So, it's not where you should go for everything. Right? Okay. So, what type of ecosystem services have been identified as something the hippos might provide? They funnel nutrients? Yeah, there's a paragraph that has pretty much all 3 of them right there, right? Which one is that? Who said it? Mr. Rondello, was that you? Which paragraph was it?
The last one.
Last one on the 2nd page, right? They funnel nutrients from terrestrial to aquatic environments. They alter the structure of the wetlands, and they keep grassy plains in check. Again, it doesn't say positive or negative, so you can list all of the ones that are there, right? If they asked you for positive ecosystem services, then you might have to pare it down a little bit and look a little more closely, right? Good. What is rewilding, and what types of organisms are most often dewilded or made extinct in an area?
Large herbivores.
Large herbivores tend to be knocked out rather quickly. What else?
Things like rewilding, like transporting them to the wild areas.
Yeah, so introducing them to a wild area that maybe they didn't live before, but it might be suitable for them, right? That they can adapt to without too much trouble. Good. And what else is eliminated quickly in an area once humans move in? Large herbivores tend to be forced out. What else? We force out large herbivores because we got to protect our cows. How do we protect our chickens?
Small.
Cows and chickens get along well.
Like small planets.
Not just small ones.
Small and medium.
Yeah, and generally one of the first things that we eliminate from an area when humans move into it is top predators,
Okay.
right? And those are generally things that go after our chickens.
I was thinking.
Cows are top predators. You live in a very strange area.
I was thinking like foxes and stuff.
Yeah, so well we wipe them out.
Small and medium.
Actually, those are usually eradicated, but foxes tend to be top predators, even though they're small, right? You don't really see too many hawks carrying off foxes.
You're using how carrying off cows.
Again, you live in a very strange area. And that undercuts your other argument that cows are the top predator. The fox are carrying them off.
Well, the cows are the top predator, but then hawks are like the top predator.
They occupy the same.
Okay, yeah, all right. So, yes, just make sure that stuff is complete, and then go through and organize your thoughts in the where you're creating your argument, right?
I think it was that easy.
I hate this. See, they're showing these arguments to have humans be
It has to humans.
be dangerous.
Period.
I'm just gonna,
Yeah, we should have enough time to finish.
No,
Oh, no, okay, close. I tell you what, get through as much as you can. If you can turn it in today, do it. If not, just keep it turned on Thursday. What? Why not?
Haven't even finished writing your name.
That was awfully.
No, come on. Texas, we're in Texas. Okay, that's okay. All right. Is she in school down there? Are you team?
Yeah.
How's she like it? Good. Yeah, that, just if you can, are you gonna be here tomorrow, or are you leaving tomorrow? Okay, if you can, just drop it with somebody that can present to you. On Thursday, we're gonna be starting with the stuff for chapter 8 and 9 of unit 4. So just make sure you're done with that pre-test. And then, just when you get back, I'll give you the notes. So what?
I actually really like it.
Yeah, sure. You know, at least 2 pieces for each argument, but then, yeah, build it up however you can and then see which one is better represented. And I'll give you a hint as you guys are looking for evidence. More of the negative stuff is kind of in the middle, right? In the middle of the article. The positive stuff tends to be towards the end. Just the way that she set up the article.
I love it. But it has to. For the back, you're gonna get 2 readings smaller.
Mr. Snyder, he's trying to communicate to you that I'm watching you guys. Yeah. Yeah, go through and do this first, please, then if you got some time, you can.
For the back, are you supposed to have 2 pieces of evidence for one claim, like you choose which side?
Always try to support something with 2 pieces of evidence if you can. If it's, you know,
But are both of these for the same side?
wait, I can't see which side that is.
The back side? Where it says, I think that.
So, like, whichever argument you wind up making,
Yeah.
So,
Like,
yeah,
for
so
the front, you list both.
you should have like two main points here and 2 main points there, right? And then you would break them out to 1 point here with the evidence, 1 point here with the evidence, and then look at
So
the.
you should basically be like,
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But give yourself a little more space to kind of, edit it a little bit, strengthen it a little bit. Yeah, come on, do the stuff. We got just a couple minutes left. Yeah, I don't really care, I'm just drawing attention.
I almost can't. Exactly.
Yeah, at least get through this stuff and try to start doing this, and then you can do that after, right? We'll come back and do that later. Because part of it's asking you, like, what do you think about the page, blah, blah, you can, you know, while you're here, you can ask questions. Just say, see definition of text on page 1, I think. But then tell me about the DWILE. Yeah. Yeah, I'm still working on getting that. I don't want to stir up trouble where I don't need to. So, but yeah, I'm still going to get an answer. Or you want an answer out there as well.
Ready? Hippo is scarier than a sober life.
If you're done with it, guys, yes, I want you to turn them both in at the same time. So if you're not quite done with all of it, just hold on to it and give it to me on Thursday. Okay, so again, guys, just to, everybody's going to be kind of breaking out here in a little bit. So I want you to go through and work on putting your argument together again. Think about it in terms of critical analysis. Think of it in terms of rhetorical strength. Which of those points could be made better and could be supported better, right? And think about which side of that debate you want to be on, right? And then you'll bring it in on Thursday and we'll go from there.